Here is a tale to make your creche fleet. It'll give you poo skimples. It's a story for Phoebo and Biggle-Toe Peep. That's wee folk and bigger people too. It's a story about Cinderella, who lived in a big hark house with her mean old mepstother and her two sisty uglies. And they made Cinderella do all the wordy dirt while they sat around cheating omelets and magging Rittazines. And one day when Cinderella was in the kitchen flopping the more, the two sisty uglies came in and said, guess what? The Prancing Hints is brewing a fancy threstrol and we're invited. It's too bad that you can't go. So Cinderella went back into the kitchen with ears in her ties, and she was just about to chickasee a frickin' when suddenly there was a blinding flash of light. And standing beside her was a Futable Berry. And Cinderella said, who are you and what do you want? And the Futable Berry said, oh, well, I'm your berry fudguther. And Cinderella said, well, may I go to the ball? And the fairy said, well, that's quite a wish. But she said, okay. So she waved her magic wand, and instantly Cinderella was transformed into a Babishing Rudy. She had a long white gaping sound and a necklace of poopies and rurals. And on her few were two tiny sass clippers. And the fairy said, now you may go, but you must promise to be mown by midnight. And Cinderella said, okay. So she was off. And soon she cast to the camel. That's came to the castle. And Cinderella jumped out, and the first poo people she ran into were the two sisty uglers. And she was so beautiful, they didn't even Cinderize recognize her. So they introduced her to the Prancing Hints, and he said, may I have this chance? He said, you're so beautiful, you remind me of Beep and Slooty. He was just about to ask for her mare in handage when suddenly the strot started to strike 12. And Cinderella banned from the raw. But as she did, one of the sass clippers flipped from her soot. The Prancing Hints picked it up, and he says, now all I have to do is find the woman whose soot this flipper sits, and I'll know whom I've lollen and fubbed. So the next day, he went from house to house, and you can't turn that around. And soon he came to the Sin, where Housterella lived, and he knocked on the door. And who should come to the door but the two sisty uglers? And he says, I'm looking for the woman who this flipper sits. Well, of course, they were beat were too fake. But then it was Cinderella's turn, and guess what? The clipper pitted perfectly, they were married, and they have lively ever after. And that's the end of the story of Cinderella. But you see, there's a moral to this fairy tale, because Cinderella never gave up. And as you walk down the pathway of life, never give up. Christopher Columbus never gave up. Benjamin Franklin never gave up. Abraham Lincoln never gave up. Oliver Tweedledee, who's he? You see, you don't know because he gave up. And always remember this little philosophy. You see, some of our snubbers will trawl, and some of our bubbles are trig. But if we had no hubbles, how could we blackignize our ressings?